A few of you were here at 10 o'clock for a most excellent presentation where we got into issues of environment, climate, ethics, and investment with two of Henrik's colleagues. And so a terrific session that I urge you to take advantage of looking on the web for the video and the reports. In our second session, in our luncheon session, I'm thrilled that we're able to continue what has really been a primary focus of the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is trying to understand population and demography issues in connection to broader foreign policy, security policy issues, and issues of conflict and cooperation. And we have two excellent speakers to lead us through a discussion of some new research on that. A word first about where we are all sitting. There are a few of you that are new. I see a lot of familiar faces, so indulge me, those of you who have heard this before. But the Woodrow Wilson Center is actually the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. We were founded in 1968 by Congress as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for facilitating dialogue between the worlds of scholarship and policy and practitioners. We do that in a number of ways, primarily through meetings in the convening function and also publications, some of which I hope you will pick up from outside. The Environmental Change and Security Program is a 13-year-old program that tries to facilitate this kind of discussion, dialogue across disciplines and across the public and private sector and practitioners and scholars in the areas of environment, population, demography, development, and health, and understanding how those issues are part of our broader foreign policy, security policy agenda as well. And so, as you might suspect, and in fact, if you even just look at the participants list, you'll see it engages a wide range of people and organizations and areas of expertise. And so that's what we're in the business of doing and bringing these communities together. Let me say, as I do on many occasions, because they support many things that we do, we're very thankful to USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health that as a collaborator and a financial supporter of these efforts, we are always very thankful for, and it's terrific to see a number of the folks involved and from that office here today. As I mentioned before, I will just say it's terrific for me personally to be able to host Henrik Urdal and scholars from PRIO as we did earlier today, and in fact will tomorrow at lunch as well. I was very lucky to spend 3 months at PRIO, and fortunately the director at the time suggested that I not spend December, January, and February there, but instead spend April, May, and June there, which is a delightful time to be in Norway where it's a bit lighter and a bit warmer. So it's a terrific resource in terms of the scholarship and the folks who are there, and I urge those of you here in both the scholarly world and the practitioner world in Washington to really take advantage of the resources and the insights that PRIO brings to the table. So it's a real thrill to have the opportunity to collaborate with them. So today, in today's discussion, Demography and Conflict, how population pressure and youth bulges affect the risk of civil war. As I mentioned, we're coming to this topic now for really building on a set of discussions that we've had, and I urge you to take a look at our website to see some of the things that have come before. But Henrik Urdal is someone who is a senior researcher at the Center for Study of Civil War at PRIO, is really someone who's been focusing his work specifically on these issues, made a number of contributions in a number of different journals and such, and has really been part of the debate in understanding how these things are connected and how they're not connected in some circumstances. And so it's terrific that Henrik has in some ways piggybacked on another meeting here in the United States. Many of us were in very cold and windy Chicago here last week. And so the PRIO folks were kind enough to make a stop in Washington on the way home. And it's where Henrik was presenting some of his work. So we're thrilled that he's able to join us. And then we're also very happy that Jen Sciubba, who is someone many of you have had the opportunity to talk with here at the Wilson Center, that Jen has agreed to be discussant for today's discussion. Jen wears two hats. One is finishing a PhD on demography and security at the University of Maryland Department of Government Politics, which is my department, so I have a predilection for Jen's work just strictly from that. But she also sits, importantly, as a consultant to the Department of Defense and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she works on policy planning and really trying to anticipate what some of the issues over the horizon are, and particularly has a portfolio that looks at global issues that are exactly the ones that we do here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I know some of the times we kind of have this vision of policy planning, and long-range planning is something that allows you to sit back and think in a very leisurely fashion, and I'm sure Jen can disabuse us of the notion that anything is leisurely in that respect. A lot of it's responding to very short-term requests for information and analysis. So we're very pleased that she's agreed to, in some ways, share both that perspective, but also just how these issues are and are not part of an agenda and a set of analyses that are going on at that institution as well. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Henrik and just say as we start that we are webcasting this meeting live, which has the implication that when it comes to Q&A, we ask that you use a microphone and let us know who you are so that the folks online can hear your question, and that video will be archived as well. So you'll be able to go back to a meeting summary, the PowerPoint, and the video as well. So Henrik, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for inviting us, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to Jennifer for agreeing to comment on this presentation. As Jeff said, I'm affiliated with the Center for the Study of Civil War, which is a center within PRIO in Oslo, and I'll be talking about my relatively recent research on the relationship between demography and conflict, some of which has been published and some which is hopefully yet to be published, or hopefully will be published at least. I thought I'd start by mentioning a few demographic trends that has caused some, if not worry, at least some interest among policymakers. The world is currently adding around 70 million people per year, and most of that growth is happening in developing countries. Secondly, there is a strong trend towards urbanization, also that happening primarily in developing countries. Over the 10-year period from 2005 to 2015, more than 200 million people will be moving from rural to urban areas, and that comes on top of the natural growth of these cities. And thirdly, we're now experiencing the largest ever youth group in history, numbering approximately 1.3 billion people, billion youth in the developing countries between the ages of 12 and 24. And this last issue has been the concern of the recent World Development Report, which is only one of many sort of policy relevant or policy documents that are now addressing the youth issue and how to facilitate large youth groups as a means to spur development. So what do the founding fathers and mothers say about demography and conflict? The 1970s and 1980s saw a debate between what we may call optimists and pessimists that to some extent exists today as well, where the optimists like Julian Simon and Esther Bosserup were arguing that population growth would only lead to more development, while pessimists like Paul Ehrlich argued that we're now seeing the end of the carrying capacity of the world, and that continued population growth is going to lead to scarcities and all kinds of catastrophes, from large-scale hungers to wars. Historically, Jack Goldstone, who was here last week, I believe, argues that history has been dominated by increasing prosperity and does not really fit the pessimist point of view, although there have been temporary population-induced global state breakdowns that have occurred in the past centuries. However, in modern times, the relationship between population and conflict, according to Goldstone, is more about local and small-scale conflicts. He also argues that conflict, in many cases, will lead to cooperation, and that the relationship between population and conflict is mediated by state responses. In much of my work, I'm using an armed conflict database, often known as the PRIO Uppsala or Uppsala PRIO dataset, or the armed conflict database. Many of you have probably heard about the data. They are frequently referred to by policymakers, although very rarely with the original source. These are data that are used by, for instance, the Human Security Report, and frequently mentioned, as I say, by policymakers and international organizations like the International Crisis Group. But again, the original source is the Uppsala PRIO conflict data that is published annually by PRIO in the Journal of Peace Research. These are the data that I use for all of my empirical studies of armed conflict and political violence, although I also use other measures of political violence. And according to this database, armed conflict is defined as being over government or territory involving armed force. There have to be at least two organized parties, of which one has to be the government. One side has to be the government, which does include that, which does imply that it does not include what we may call one-sided violence or violence between two, for instance, ethnic groups without the involvement of a state. There is also a requirement of a minimum of 25 battle-related deaths. Battle-related here means both civilian and military personnel killed in activities related directly to the armed conflict, but it does not include indirect death, say from lack or breakdown of medical infrastructure, undernutrition, that kind of mortality, which is clearly related to armed conflict. And conflicts that pass the 1,000 battle death threshold per year is commonly regarded as wars. Just to give you a brief introduction to what the picture of armed conflict is over time, you can see the very bottom line, the light brown is what we call extrasystemic conflicts. Those are conflicts, typically colonial independence movements fighting colonial powers, so independence movements. Then we have the dark brown line, which is the number of interstate conflicts between states. And as you can see, the number of interstate conflicts is very, very low. And actually, the past few years, there haven't been very many interstate conflicts. So the bulk of the conflicts are two different kinds of intrastate conflict. The yellow segment is intrastate conflicts with only domestic actors, while the orange conflicts are intrastate conflicts but with international participation. And as you can see, there has been, since the peak in the 1992-1993 period, there has been a dramatic decline in the number of conflicts. We're now actually down to a level of the number of conflicts hasn't been lower since the mid-1970s. And if you only look at, I don't have a graph for that, but if you only look at wars, meaning above 1,000 battle deaths, the decline is even sharper. Turning now to the location of armed conflicts, the green countries are countries that have a conflict in their territory, and I know that many of you are going to ask about why the US is on the map. That's because of Al Qaeda, conflict with Al Qaeda, which is not really on the territory, but it's US is a hard case to code. But apart from that, if you just neglect that, you can see that there is only one conflict left in Latin America, which is Colombia. Then we have clusters of conflicts. The red spots, by the way, are the geographical locations of these conflicts, which is important in many cases, obviously, because conflicts don't really affect the whole of the countries in most cases. Like in Russia, you have conflict. The whole of Russia is green, but the conflict is in Chechnya. So there's a cluster of conflicts in Africa and there's a belt of conflicts from Turkey through the Caucasus into Southeast Asia. Turning now to the general population pressure arguments, there are three different schools looking at the effect of population pressure. The resource scarcity school of thought, Thomas Homer Dixon, Colin Kahl, generally argues that resource scarcity causes an overuse of resources. Population pressure causes overuse of resources, and which may lead to conflict. I'll get into that argument in more detail in a second. Then we have the technological optimists like Julian Simon and Esther Bolserup, arguing that while we may very well experience scarcities because of population pressure and degradation, such scarcities are likely to be solved by increasing development and use of technology. So scarcity may actually trigger development in some cases. And particularly is this the case in the long run, and particularly Julian Simon argues that more people just means more ingenuity and greater opportunities to overcome scarcities. Thirdly, there is the political ecology tradition, which generally argues that it's not human overuse that causes scarcity conflicts, but it's the global and local maldistribution of resources that is the source of conflicts over resources. So just to give you a brief overview of the stages of the argument in the resource scarcity model, which is what informs my research on the relationship between resources and conflict, or population pressure, resources, and conflict. The resource scarcity argument claims that population pressure in combination with other sources of resource depletion and also sources of resource distribution or maldistribution of resources will lead to different forms of resource scarcity. Resource scarcity in local areas, again, leads to economic stagnation and migration to other areas or to urban hotspots. And you will see as a result of that increased resource competition, which under certain conditions, particularly where states are weak, you might have armed conflict. I'm just briefly going to present this is the results from an article that I published in Journal of Peace Research in 2005 called People versus Malthus, Population Pressure, Environmental Degradation and Armed Conflict Revisited. In that article, I'm using the armed conflict database only as a measure of political violence. And in the article, on the country level, I don't find very much support for the resource scarcity argument. Population growth is not significant. It's not a significant factor for conflict onset over a lot of different model specifications. Population density, similarly, it does not seem to impact conflict. Actually, in one of the models, I do find that higher densities or greater scarcities of arable land is actually associated with a lower risk of armed conflict, which may speak to the long-term effects that optimists are describing. The interaction between population growth and population density is not significant for most models, but is actually significant for the 1970s, which was the height of neo-Malthusian or resource scarcity thought. And whether that is coincidental or actually does represent a different trend in 1970s is not sure, but it's a very interesting finding. Finally, urban growth is not significant for most models, and actually for the post-Cold War periods, countries with the highest urbanization rates are also experiencing lower risk of conflict onset. So if overall pressures on the national level and over time doesn't matter, then what? And it has been argued by Jack Olson and others that we need to decompose demography, and particularly to look at age distributions, or what is usually referred to as youth bulges. And at this point, I should say that youth bulges is really somewhat of a misnomer, because it has become a term, but really refers to age structures where you do have cohorts that are larger than both older and younger cohorts, while the youth bulge argument generally refers to situations where you have very young age structures in disregard of the size of the younger age cohorts. Secondly, if there is no relationship between population pressure and conflict on the national level, we should go below the national level to look at different ways of disaggregating the study of population pressure and armed conflict, both by disaggregating geographically and using political units of analysis. I'll return to that. There is an increasing awareness of the importance of age composition or youth bulges, represented here by two notable examples. One is Samuel Huntington, who relatively short time after September 11 said that, "I don't think Islam is any more violent than any other religions, but the key factor is the demographic factor, and that the Muslim bulge will fade and is about to fade." Secondly, Farid Zakaria, the editor of Newsweek, said in approximately the same time that the Arab world has a problem with its ADAS in more than one sense. Globalization has caught it at a bad demographic moment. So, what are the arguments pertaining to the relationship between age cohorts and or young age cohorts and armed conflict? Large youth cohorts have been argued to. I should say that for this purpose, I use a measure of youth bulges or age composition as the number of 15 to 24-year-olds as a percentage of the total adult population of 15 years and above. It has been argued that large youth cohorts represent a large number of available rebel recruits, particularly in poor countries where the opportunity cost of young people is generally low, particularly where you have high unemployment rates. Young people generally provide cheaper labor, and unemployment is generally higher among young people. And also, the relative cohort size argument says that large cohorts also generally have even lower opportunity cost than youth belonging to average-sized cohorts due to what is called then the relative cohort size effect. There are some empirical studies suggesting that large cohorts experience a particular pressure on wages. There is also an issue about the economic climate at a time when large youth cohorts enter into the labor market. So economic growth would be a contextual factor that would affect the relationship between youth bulges and conflict. It has also been suggested that while education is generally a factor that increases the opportunity cost, it is a particular problem when countries are addressing large youth cohorts by expanding particularly higher education without at the same time securing opportunities for these highly educated youth in the labor market when they're done with their education. So what you have produced is you produce these large cohorts of very well educated, highly mobilizable youth, and if you don't then provide them with opportunities, that might spur violence. It has also been suggested that particularly in autocratic regimes, you might experience to see large youth bulges increasing the risk of conflict. And finally, since youth are generally overrepresented among migrants from rural to urban areas, high rates of urbanization may actually be a contextual factor that influences the relationship between youth bulges and conflict. But there are also those who focus on the possible demographic dividend of large youth cohorts. And research on the economic consequences of population growth generally find that countries that are well into their demographic transitions, where large youth bulges are preceding substantially smaller cohorts, may actually experience an economic boost. But this depends on the flexibility in the economy and the labor market. And what I try to do in my study is to distinguish between youth bulges in the context of high and low fertility to investigate whether there might in fact be a demographic peace dividend. So at this point, I would like to just make clear that I'm not promoting any kind of demographic determinism. Large youth cohorts may actually be a factor that can boost development, and not only a risk factor. But in countries and areas where conditions are not facilitating the integration of youth into the labor market, large youth groups may actually increase, in particular large youth groups who experience high levels of social and economic exclusion. This may create fertile grounds for political violence. So my paper on youth bulges that was published in the International Studies Quarterly in September last year is a global model. It covers virtually all countries from 1950 to 2000. I look at three different measures of political violence. It's the armed conflict onset, and there are two measures that, or two sets of data that have been collected for the State Failure Task Force. One on terrorism and one on rights and violent demonstrations. And I also look at a lot of different contextual factors to address this relationship. What I generally find is that youth bulges is associated with all these three different measures of political violence. But the contextual factors associated with higher levels of violence do seem to change, and frankly, I don't find very strong and very consistent results for some of these contextual factors that have been suggested to play into the relationship. But unfortunately, the kind of data that we would have liked to have most, for particularly unemployment rates for youth, are simply not available for the number of countries and the time period that I'm studying here. But what I do find is that for armed conflict, which is the first column here, I find generally that youth bulges is increasing the risk of conflict. Most of the contextual factors are not significant, statistically significant. What I do find is that when I interact with regime type, both very autocratic and very democratic countries are at a somewhat higher risk of experiencing armed conflict onset. Looking at terrorism, I find, again, a higher risk of youth bulges. And I also find interesting interaction effects when large youth bulges coincide with economic recession. There seems to be a higher risk of terrorism events. And similarly, after large expansions in tertiary education, youth bulges seem to have an increasing impact on the risk of terrorism events. Turning to rights and violent demonstrations, again, I find generally a positive relationship. For the contextual factors, I only find that youth bulges in the context of continued high dependency ratios, meaning youth bulges happening in a context of continued high fertility, seems to be increasing the risk of rights and violent demonstrations. The results then generally complement research by Richard Sinkara and others who have also done quantitative research in this field. I find no support for the threshold values suggested by Huntington and others, that when you pass a certain threshold, you suddenly, become very much more likely to have a conflict. It seems to be more of a linear effect. I also find no effect of urbanization playing into that relationship. A 1 percentage point increase in youth bulges appears to increase the risk of armed conflict onset by 4%. And in countries where youth make up 35% of the total adult population, the risk of conflict, all other factors being equal, increases by 150% compared to having youth bulges at the size of developed countries, which is about 17%. And 44 developing countries were on or above the 35% youth bulge level in 2000. And again, it shouldn't be understood as being a threshold, but it says something about the differences in risk. Just briefly to give you an overview of how the youth populations are growing. This is from the World Development Report based on United Nations population prospects. there is a rapidly increasing youth population in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a decreasing youth population in East Asia and Pacific. South Asia still has a few years of increasing youth populations before the decline starts. And also there is a growing youth population, although declining. The rate of growth is declining in the Middle East and North Africa. Just to also give you a few pictures of how this demographic window may look like. This is the South Korean age pyramid for 2000. The age composition or the demographic transition in South Korea and other newly industrialized countries have been argued to be responsible for approximately 1/3 of the rapid economic growth in these countries. And as you can see, the dependency ratios, the under 15 cohorts, are significantly smaller than the cohorts from, say, 20 to 39. This is the typical country where the demographic window has yet to open, Zambia, where you have very large youth cohorts due to continued high fertility. And finally, although there are not so many good news from Iran these days, and you may be questioning whether this is good news, but Iran is definitely experiencing an opening of the window. This is the projected population pyramid 2010, which shows that by that Iran is going to have large youth cohorts and significantly declining dependency ratios, which may provide, together with other factors, greater sources for economic growth and possibly also political stability. Turning now to my study on demography and violence in India. This is a state-level analysis, Indian states, covering the time period from 1956 to 2002. I used 3 different measures of violence. One is the armed conflict data set. I also consider another data set on violent political events, which is also being collected for the State Failure Project. And third, a measure specifically on Hindu-Muslim riots. And I have a broad set of explanatory variables. Again, what we do in the design of this study is that we take each of the Indian states and observe them once a year. So we have a data set on state year. What I find is that there is more of a relationship between resource scarcity variables and different measures of political violence for India than I find for the cross-national study. This may be due to it could be because political violence, or the relationship between population pressure and political violence, is actually stronger on the local level, but there is also the additional element of more data being available for more different items that we want to measure for India. Obviously, India has long and good data collection traditions, and we have much more data to test our hypothesis for India than for a global sample of states. Looking at armed conflict, I find that rural population density increases the risk of conflict, although not the interaction with population growth. Urban growth, as for the global study, lowers the risk of conflict, while rural density and combined with low agricultural yield increases the risk of conflict. And also, when agricultural wages are declining, the risk of conflict increases. Interestingly, I have a measure for rural inequality and actually a lot of different socioeconomic variables collected by the World Bank. Thomas Homer Dixon and others argue that it's particularly when high levels of scarcity interacts with levels of inequality that the risk of conflict increases. I don't find this relationship to be significant for any of the political violence measures that I'm looking at. Youth bulges, on the other hand, increases the risk of both armed conflict, violent political events, and riots, particularly when there are high levels of urban inequality. Again, for violent political events, I find some of the interaction effects to be significant, but for riots, which are primarily an urban phenomenon, I don't find the population pressure or resource scarcity measures to be significant, except from the short-term decrease in agricultural wages. Also, the high urban growth rates are not significant for this measure, which we would expect to be the relationship between population pressure or resource scarcity and riots. So what are the conclusions and recommendations from these studies? I argue that population-induced resource scarcity does not seem to increase the risk of armed conflict across countries on the country level. However, the local effects of population pressure on violence point to the importance of internal distribution and the preventive capacity as well as adaptability of central and local governments and of individuals rather than absolute scarcity. And efforts to minimize, I'm not going to claim that based on these few studies, I have the full panorama of what we're going to do to curb political violence globally or in India, but I'm going to tentatively suggest some conclusions based on my own findings. Efforts to minimize conflict related to resource scarcity is that we should develop measures to enhance local resource management capacity. The targeted programs aimed at curbing population pressure should be in place in some contexts, but it needs to be adapted to local contexts. Finally, programs aimed at providing alternative opportunities for young people in rural areas should be in place, in particular when agricultural production and wages are declining. As for the youth bulge findings, I argue that it seems to be that large youth cohorts in developing countries with low opportunity costs are associated with higher risks of political violence. Although as fertility declines, a demographic window of opportunity may open that could also represent a peace dividend. Finally, low-intensity conflicts may be a relatively inexpensive way of signaling political demands, hence the significance of factors that make such conflicts marginally less costly, because youth bulges seem to increase the risk of low-intensity conflict but not of high-intensity conflict. So youth bulges may in fact be a factor that make rebel groups able to overcome the hurdle of waging low-intensity conflict but probably not high-intensity conflict. Efforts to minimize conflict may include measures to engage youth in development, like education, microfinance, government programs, and increased labor market flexibility. We should pay attention to the role of migration. At least in Europe, there is an increasing concern about high levels of migration from many of these countries that have very large youth cohorts. This is also the same that you experience regionally, particularly in the Middle East. And if migration opportunities are severely restricted, the pressure from youth bulges may increase internally in some of these countries that usually export large number of youth abroad. Greater attention has to be paid to the needs and opportunities of young men. And finally, we should be monitoring the employment situation of educated youth in particular. But there are still a lot of holes in the research or in the empirical literature on youth and conflict in particular. One of the issues that I would like to see more research on is on the relationship between youth bulges and political stability. I know that Richard Zinkara is working on this, but this is really a very promising area. We should look at age composition and exclusion in urban centers specifically. How the role of education plays in more specifically using new global data sets. We should definitely look more into what the conditions that facilitate a demographic bonus in terms of lower risk of armed conflict and other forms of political violence are. Studies on micro-level studies of rebel recruitment would be useful, and also on youth bulges in post-conflict settings. Finally, the World Bank has pointed to the grave lack of evaluation of programs aimed at integrating youth into development, and an increased evaluation of that kind of programs to assess lessons learned would be incredibly useful to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrik. We're gonna have to use you as a model for how people doing empirical and quantitative research can come to the Wilson Center and make it easily accessible to those of us who do not specialize in empirical work. So thank you for that very clear presentation. Jen, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to Jeff and all of the staff at the Environmental Change and Security Program for having me here, and for Henrik, whose work I very much admire. I'm glad to be here today. First, a disclaimer that my comments are my own and do not represent those of the Department of Defense. And I suppose an additional disclaimer that I have a cold, so I'm very sorry for being stuffy and sniffy. I was asked today to speak about how this type of research is useful for those of us working on U.S. foreign policy. And so first I will give you my impressions of what people in the Department of Defense think of the connections between youth bulge and security, how they use the research, the utility of Henrik's research in particular, and then again end with the avenues for future exploration. So first, my impressions of what most people think about the youth bulge thesis. I think even the attendance today and looking at the list of affiliations points to the fact that most people are aware that such a connection does exist. And I find that to be true within the Department of Defense as well. And I think that people's knowledge of the youth bulge thesis is based mainly on their own experiences and logic and on what they read in the media. In particular, the Department of Defense, I'm often told by military colleagues that the youth bulge thesis holds a lot of water for them because they think about themselves. And they think about the fact that many of them joined the military between the ages of 18 and 24, and they remember what they felt, their feelings of angst and uncertainty and opportunity at that age, and when they fought alongside or worked alongside people from other countries of the same ages. And so for many of them, they think that this type of thesis must hold true, and must be even more so true in countries where young men have less opportunities for external validation and many more limited opportunities. Second, which I think is true for everyone, not just limited to the Department of Defense or the government, is that demographic work tends to, it seems like it's just very logical, right? That conflict in youth, you may have only a basic understanding there's a relationship, but it seems very plausible that young men would, and young people in general, if you lack opportunities, that you'd get mad about it and you'd fight about it. And the same with gender and security as well. There are a lot of talk about if there are too many young men in particular, well, you know what happens when you get a bunch of young men together, they're going to get in fights. And for conflict and natural resources, it seems like it would be true that if you need water and the country next to you needs water and there's not any water, that you'd fight over it. But a lot of research points to the fact that maybe that's not actually the case. So can we rely on logic or not? And I think a lot of this work that is going deeper is showing us that where something may seem logical, the results are not necessarily what you would expect. And of course, we all see in the media, especially after 9/11 and with U.S. involvement more in the Middle East, it is brought to the attention more of the media that there are a lot of young men, and so there are a lot of alarmist visions that lack nuance and context in the media today. And I think that those articles very much affect the impressions of people who are consuming a lot of news and have a lot on their plates, such as people at the Department of Defense. They have to cover a host of issues, and so the biggest headlines often get your attention. I think there are three levels of the way that this research is used within the Department of Defense. On one level is just your basic intelligence. And as many of you know, after 9/11, there was a big push for more open source intelligence. That clandestine work may not be the most useful, that in fact often it's right out there in the open, and scholars, academics, anthropologists who've been to a region might know best what's actually happening. And so, excuse me, I think that demographic work with security certainly can provide this early warning signpost of instability. And so there are many offices I know within the intelligence community that look at warning and what indicators along the way, a nasty cocktail mix of things, would lead to conflict. The second way is being ready to react after something happens. If you're a policymaker and you've been told of those signposts, you might be able to pre-position your forces in hot spots to be ready if a conflict were to arise, gain specific capabilities, such as for urban warfare. If it has been shown that urbanization under conditions X, Y, and Z makes for a nasty mess, and we're expected to have to fight or conduct peacekeeping operations in urban areas, you're going to need to prepare those capabilities well in advance. And the third way, I think, is that an understanding of demographics helps you evaluate the strength and utility of your alliances. And what I mean by that is that if you are the United States and you've formed very, very close alliances with a country where every indication is that that's got a bad demographic future and a lot of bad things coming together, perhaps you should think about that alliance, how likely it is to continue in the future, and perhaps what things you could do to help that country or strengthen that alliance or back yourself up in another way. And the third way that I think this research is useful is preparation to avoid an event. And that's where you really get to the policy aspect of this. And it's where are the policy choices to be made? Is democratization useful? Is it possible the United States should help a state more during its democratization process? As many of us know, and Henrik points out in one of his pieces, that actual process itself is where you end up with a lot of conflict. And so just a general awareness of where decisions are being made. Development, of course, there are lots of decisions. You certainly wouldn't want to take away aspects of development, but an awareness that a lot of higher education with no jobs is not necessarily a good thing. And so just knowing that your policy decisions may bring about unintended consequences is very important, and certain areas where we could pay attention. The utility of Henrik's research for policy action, there are a couple of conclusions I think that are particularly appropriate. One is that he found through his research that security is not a good rationale for reducing population growth, and other factors are more important. I think that's good for the Department of Defense because there's not much that DoD can do about population growth. So hearing that it's all about population growth wouldn't leave you with very many choices that you could make within the department. So hearing that there are other factors that are important means that you're not powerless and there are things you can do, especially paying attention to interactions with other variables and other trends like agriculture and such. And another thing is that, as Henrik mentioned with his research on India, it very much shows that demography is not destiny and that governance and leadership and overall political capacity very much matter. I think those are traits that the U.S. Foreign policy can positively affect. Working with other countries to develop governance and political capacity is a definite concrete step. For the future, one thing that I very much admire about this body of work is that it shows progression. And with each piece, Henrik builds on and tries to move the debate forward with increasing levels of sophistication. And that can't be said for a lot of work on demography. It is often rehashing the same themes and the same theses from the past 30 years without moving forward. And that's not at all what you see when you look at this body of work. For example, Henrik moves from a basic equation of international armed conflict to disaggregating the conflict variable and then going inside the state. And that is very useful. So one area that I think could continue to be developed is the specificity of the variables. I like how Henrik redefines variables such as youth bulge to add more weight to the findings. What are different ways that we could define these and measure these? And certainly from a defense perspective, the definition and the operationalization of conflict likely needs to be expanded to add nuance. Henrik does this with terrorism and rioting and Hindu-Muslim riots, and it's something I would definitely like to see continued. as we all know, everyone in the government is interested in terrorism nowadays, have to be. And so just opening up the political conflict variable in those ways are very useful. Another way is with the level of analysis. I admire that Henrik continues to dig deeper, and his work on India, looking at the sub-state level, is very important, since so many demographic trends are much better understood at this level. Birth rates, mortality, education, gender balances, ethnicity, just age balances in general. Those are all very different depending on what region of a state you're in. And so by not treating the state as this black box and going inside and understanding that there are different dynamics within a state from region to region are very important. And context is the final area where I think there's a lot more work to be done. Under what conditions do these demographic variables matter? Because those are where you can actually make your policy choices here in the government. For example, in People versus Malthus, Henrik finds that urbanization is associated with decreased risk of conflict in the 1990s. So what was different about that urbanization, if anything? Whenever I hear the 90s, I always think about the Asian tigers, and certainly their urbanization had been going on long before the 90s, but was there a particular region of the world that was pushing this effect statistically? Was there a certain kind of urbanization going on? And what does today's urbanization look like compared to then? We read a lot, and the World Bank has written a lot about slums and the slumization. So what's going on with different urbanization patterns that make some good for peace and development and some bad? Where are the policy choices being made that drive those differences? Because that's where the government can have effect. And context is important because most demographic trends could be good for U.S. goals or they could be bad. Youth certainly brings with it innovation and labor supply, but it could also bring conflict. Urbanization can bring with it concentrated services within one area, sanitation and education, but it can also make populations very vulnerable to disease and natural disaster. Aging could lessen the impact of a population on the environment and allow state to invest more in each citizen, or it could strain state resources to the point of collapse. And international migration is good because labor mobility keeps economies running, but it also brings ethnic and religious tension, or can bring. Another area that we're interested in policy planning as well is interaction with other trends, and this work does touch on that with natural resources. Environmental trends, conflict, technology, governance. How does demographics interact with each of those trends to produce a different kind of effect? And I suppose my final comment is I think that this kind of work can be both good and bad for policy. Quantitative research is good because it produces very clear and easily digestible results when they're translated so eloquently as Henrik did today. But it often does lack context, which makes it vulnerable to exploitation and misunderstanding. And when you're in the policy world, there is so much information that you have to be aware of. What does the headline look like for what you're writing? What does your research headline look like? Other people could very much misinterpret. I think that Henrik definitely understands that, and he progressively tries to peel back and go a deeper layer with his work. And programs like the Environmental Change and Security Program as well are very good for translating these complex situations into policy-relevant pieces. So I certainly encourage Henrik and the folks, Jeff and folks here, to continue to bring the context to this type of work and continue to dig deeper to help us understand what these demographic variables really mean. Thank you.
Well, it's terrific. Jen, you can be Exhibit A for how to be a discussant. So that's, you guys present a good model. We'll just send out the video link to this session for instructions to future speakers. We have some time, really actually a lot of time, which is terrific. It means that you guys were well organized. Time for discussion. Again, ask that you use the microphone and introduce yourself. I saw a hand in the back already. Is there a question? Okay, well, maybe not. We can start up front. Ken, if you could bring the microphone down here.
Thank you. I think I have...
You could tell us who you are, ma'am. Sorry.
I'm Heather Jeffen. I'm CEO of System Sciences, Inc. I have two maybe questions for whoever wants to answer it. I didn't see any in your presentation the effect of the arms movement from one country to another on the youth. I mean, most conflict requires certain arms and to be able to use it. If they don't have it, then maybe the conflict will be not so damaging. And the second question, I don't know, either one of you can answer it. We have learned to use decision support simulation model. I don't know whether you have used those, especially when you're talking about population, because then you simulate your result and you anticipate the outcome before even it happened. Then you can take measure. As Jennifer said, we need to be able to take measure before it happened. Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation.
These, if I may.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. These are both excellent comments, and PRIO is actually also part of PRIO is actually collecting data on small arms transfers, and that would be incredibly interesting. I thank you for the idea. It's really an incredibly good idea to look at that in connection with youth bulges. Actually, I know that there is a project by a PhD student in Oxford who's looking at something similar now, but it would be interesting to look at that on a global or at least regional level. As for the second point, there is a development towards trying to forecast conflict, which is very complicated, obviously. But the good thing about demographic factors is at least that you have a fairly good idea about how they will develop over the next 10, 15, perhaps even 20 years. So we are trying to tap into that, and hopefully within a not too long time period, we're going to be able to at least provide some preliminary suggestions for how to project the risk of armed conflict. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I would just add on the last point that many in the government, many of you probably out there, use the scenario-based planning, which and also computer models. And your latter comment reminded me that a lot of us use demographic work to play out some of the worst case scenarios and best case scenarios, and if you do X, do you get Y? And I think that's appropriate.
Okay. Anne?
Anne Van Dusen, Georgetown University. There's been some speculative research recently on the propensity for conflict in youth populations where there is a great gender disparity, where preference for male children over time has resulted in many more young men than young women. Can you comment on that? I know it's not in your data, but does it sound plausible, or what do either of you think?
It is actually in the India paper, because India does experience quite dramatic differences in sex ratios between different regions. So I've tried to test for that. I know that I'm familiar with that literature. It focuses, as far as I can see, primarily on China and primarily on criminal rather than political violence. But as far as I can see, the argument could be pertinent also to political violence. Generally, I'm not going to. I may not agree with all the sort of connotations made in that literature, but you could also argue that large male or very skewed sex ratios also represent like youth bulges, a somewhat higher availability of potential recruits because of lower opportunity costs. So I actually do find some relationship between the interaction of youth bulges and very skewed sex ratios. But I wouldn't claim it's very difficult to do that on the global level, obviously, because this is really a phenomenon that is happening in a handful of countries. But I wouldn't dismiss the possibility that there is something to sex ratios as well.
And as an additional reference for that, Valerie Hudson, which her Bare Branches book is one of the primary sources of that work, was here a year and a half ago and such. So we have that meeting online and her presentation. And then sitting right next to you, Richard Sankata had a book review, which actually took a fairly critical perspective on that. And I think, Rich, if it doesn't do too much kind of damage to a one-line summary, in part you made, I think, a very interesting point about the ability to you have a much bigger pool if you'll marry someone much younger than you, as well as the mobility of women across borders. And so we obviously see that both illicit and legal and illegal in terms of the movement of women to fill some of those spots in terms of shortcomings. But anyway, we have some resources on the website that hopefully will give you multiple views on that. Have Dick and then Charlie.
Dick Smith, State Department. In your excellent presentation, I was glad you highlighted migration as one of the problems that needs further research. I want to expand on that a little bit and suggest areas that need to be looked at. The youth bulge has a counterpart in the developed countries. Europe, Japan, Russia, almost all of the developed world is not only flattening out, but in many cases reducing their populations in general, and certainly their proportion of youth. And this is really quite a serious problem for them, because unless they can maintain those populations better, they're going to have real productivity problems, development problems, problems maintaining the assistance to elderly populations that are necessary. Now, on the face of it, it looks like a very neat solution. You have a bulge here, and you have sort of a depression there. You just move, you run up migration a lot, and you solve the problem. But the history in Europe particularly, and in Japan certainly, less so in the United States, although it's still a problem here, the ability to absorb populations without creating friction and conflict is a problem. And I think in terms of policy, we really need to look at how we can help countries better integrate substantial migration flows, because they're inevitable if the right things are going to happen in terms of the needs of both developed and developing countries.
I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at some of the European countries that now have fertility rates of close to one child per woman over a lifetime, Europe simply doesn't have the population reproduction necessary to sustain the kind of both the demography that they have now. And while I do acknowledge that the challenge of integrating migrants into the economies and into the societies, particularly in Europe, I cannot see any other avenues than, I mean, if Europe should shut out migrants, it would have quite devastating consequences.
Jen, do you want to, given that's a big part of your dissertation, have a comment on that?
I think that there are a lot of policy choices to be made there, besides just with immigration, though, and the the recent Population Development Review 1950 to 2050 book, which was an issue that just came out. One of the authors talks about the number of policy choices that could be made now with the latent workforce that's there, that with really making more decisions to bring people who are not working into the workforce, and kind of runs the numbers of how much that could delay any crunch of aging, but then also runs the numbers that were you to simply rely on immigration to replace the population. The numbers are astounding, and you know that they're politically infeasible, and possibly just logistically infeasible. And so I know that there have been a number of programs in Europe that are drawing attention to the idea of integration. I think that's very important. Just the more that it is spoken about, and the more that people bring that to the forefront and recognize that it's a problem, and work to solve that is good.
Okay, Charles.
Yeah, Charles Teller, USAID Global Health. I think that the speaker and the discussants have brought us further along in the contextualization of the argument. I think a few years ago we were kind of stuck on these global correlations. So I think getting down to the case studies, India, I think there should be a lot other case studies that would be useful. But I'm still struck that it seems to be correlational analysis. You show these 2x2 tables, and we're often not sure whether it's cause and effect or whether it's pure coincidence that you find in those cells concurrence. I think that, Jennifer, while you accuse the demographers of being stodgy, I think the population scientists who work in development have been really active and have not stuck in the Malthusian, Simonian argument. They've gone far, far ahead. And I think a lot of it is coming down to the context. When you look at the so-called fragile states, and you see where they are in the demographic transition, there's no correlation. They're at all different levels in the demographic transition. They're pre-transition, early, late, and post. There was no correlation there. I mean, I've come around to saying that you really have to look at where there is conflict, what type of conflict it is, as you have disaggregated, and see whether these different demographic factors have exacerbated it or has helped it. I think conceptually would be help to see your conceptual model, because I still think you're at a correlational analysis. I would think you'd at least want to distinguish between those conflicts that are caused by historic, ideological factors in which the youth have almost nothing to do in at least causing it, versus the more micro, the resource, scarcity environments where the youth don't have opportunity, where they feel hopeless, where they take arms themselves, where they have gangs, where they move around. That's really where the youth do try to take conflict into their own hands. So I think, as a suggestion, would be good to look at the conceptual framework and then look at the role of this youth bulge. It couldn't be positive or negative. And secondly, as this gentleman said, there's a lot of demographic literature on migration, urbanization, development. There's a lot. I didn't see much reference to that literature. Basically, and I did my dissertation on this topic, basically there's no correlation. There is no causal association between migration or urbanization or urban growth and conflict. It really depends on where they're coming from and what the opportunities are. But in general, the only conclusion in the literature and on the recent books is that in general, the youth, if they come from rural areas, are better off if they are permanent migrants, if they stay in the urban. They themselves are better off. Whether society is better off or not, that's another question. And finally, I think the data problems. We have data problems when we're asked to look at fragile states because it's hard to get good data from fragile states. But you are missing a lot of some of the very important data on youth. The unemployment, the underemployment, the landlessness, the psychosocial aspirations of these youth. You really have to look into that to see whether it's they're an independent or a dependent variable.
Where did you see any 2x2 tables in this presentation? I think you're completely misrepresenting his work.
Well, it's not 2x2. Let's say they're dichotomous. You have rows and you have columns, and you have a cell which is a 2x2, what I would call a 2x2.
I'll give you guys a chance to respond.
Yeah, sure. The full papers are out on the webpage, and of course these are all multivariate models, I'd be happy to show you the full models. For simplicity, I just presented the findings, but these are not bivariate relationships. Your points about contextualization is I think important, and is actually where we're trying to go from these global correlates, which may or may not, of course, suggest that there is a causal relationship, but I think that that's a very useful starting point. And now we're moving into disaggregated studies of political and also geographical units. I have a project now where I hope to start looking at cities in specific, to look at urban centers, and hopefully also we will be able to move down to look at what are the motivations for individuals that are recruited to rebel movements, that may actually enlighten us in some of these ways. What are the relationships between social exclusion, economic exclusion, and conflict? And I think we're moving there. And there's also you say that there is no studies on the relationship between finding the relationship between migration and conflict. And there is actually one study that came out in an international organization now last year looking at refugees in conflict, which does find. And the argument there is it probably relates to the refugees leading to spread of conflict into neighbor countries. But our ability to try to disentangle some of these relationships are now increasing as we are getting more reliable data on a lot of different items. And as you said, we should have wanted to have much more data. And some of these relationships we cannot really test for a global sample of states. We have to go beyond the state level. And I really hope that there will be funding available for this kind of research, because I think it is incredibly relevant and important.
Okay, Rich Sinkata.
Rich Sinkata. I work for the Long-Range Analysis Unit of the National Intelligence Council. And I would like to defend, although I don't agree very often. I mean, not very often. Very often we come to some little argument. But I will say that Henrik's work has never said that a youth bulge causes civil conflict. I think the word risk was up there, and he made a point about its contribution to recruitment. Recruitment does not make a war. What it does is make a tense situation, whether it's on the political side, whether it's on an insurgency side, whether it's on a government side. And this is where I sometimes argue with Henrik, is I think it's as telling when you see the bloating of a government bureaucracy and a government security force. That's as telling as an insurgency is. I mean, you're bound to have some kind of conflict just because you have people who have weapons and they're in poor control, and you have an inefficient bureaucracy. This is a big problem in countries with the youth bulge. And you seem to say that there was a monocausal, that Henrik had to prove that this was the only thing that made failed states. I don't think Henrik ever said that, and I don't think anybody in this research field has. There are many things that cause states to fail. The suggestion is that having a youth bulge may put countries in danger, at risk, not causing it. But my question for you, Henrik, was first of all, I missed it in your ISQ paper, I guess, but I thought you touched on an interaction between the youth bulge and regime. And I thought, and it sounded, at least when you said it, I thought it was a little counterintuitive to the literature, to what the literature suggests. Maybe I missed it. I missed lots of things. And the other thing is, I always wonder why you seem to hesitate to say something about girls' education and the availability of family planning, because no demographer would ever sell those short as moving forward the demographic transition. And I've never seen it on your slides. And I think it's much more powerful than any of the recommendations that you have suggested.
As for family planning programs, that's not my primary focus, as you say. I think the solutions are to be found in primarily in many other factors, particularly contextual factors. But I'm not going to argue that fertility reduction is not going to be one factor that can contribute to moving countries into development. As for the relationship between regime type and conflict, I think that the research program that you have suggested on how youth are related to political stability is something that would be incredibly useful to look at. My findings is somewhat counterintuitive, because I wouldn't actually expect democracies to be more at risk with large youth bulges. But there might be, plausible explanation to that as well. That youth bulges in autocracies, in particular, provide greater opportunities, since autocracies generally have a much lower risk of conflict. Both very sort of ideal autocracies and ideal democracies have a lower risk of conflict than sort of the intermediate regimes. So youth bulges may be one among several factors that increases the risk that the autocratic regimes are also experiencing conflict.
So you said it back the other way when you.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry.
Okay. I have a question of my own, and then also a colleague of mine brought a question that was emailed from somebody watching from Costa Rica. My question first is how, if you've had the opportunity to brief this to European governments, how have they been on the security side or the foreign assistance side, and what kind of feedback, interest, conclusions are drawn? I mean, we got a good sense of kind of how, in a U.S. government security perspective, these ideas are framed and taken up and such. And so, as you have the opportunity to talk to those folks or the folks at the bank, we'd be interested to know how it's received. And then I'll add a second one, someone you know well, Tom Diljanius at University of Peace. Somebody who's been very active in the Toronto group and the environment as a cause of conflict thesis in terms of on the scarcity side. Tom was interested in two questions. One, a specific one, wondering whether you'd tested the relationship between subnational levels of wage differentiation among agricultural product producers and migration and conflict. And I'll show you the note here so you can get that. And then the other, and I'm not going to do this justice, but Tom has a question. He's concerned that the testing in terms of the environmental scarcity model, the causal model, has the linear process doesn't necessarily capture some of the interaction effects in what he's suggesting is the Homer-Dixon model, where it's not. He's suggesting that the notion that the outright scarcity is not driving conflict, but it's an interaction with the social effects. And of course, this is the question of the constitution, the environmental scarcity variable. This is a question that you're familiar with. So if you could grapple with my poor summary of his question, and I'll give you the cheat sheet there. And the European government's one as well would be terrific.
Yeah, I'll start with that one. I'm not invited every other day to speak with European governments about this problem, so I would have to think hard about that if that opportunity should arise. But obviously, I think that this has two sides. I mean, one is the security side, and although I think we should be careful not to overemphasize that. I think it's definitely a factor that should be emphasized. But obviously, the issue of focusing on how the youth can be integrated into development is obviously a huge development issue and should be addressed like a development issue and not only as a security issue. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that addresses it fully. As for the questions from Costa Rica, the data that I've been using for the India study, where we do have some wage data on India, are average time series wage data for the agricultural sector as a whole, and doesn't really distinguish between different groups of producers, which would be very interesting. That data could actually be available, and I think it's a very good idea to look at that, especially since there seems to be a possibility that agricultural wages do appear to be part of that relationship. I also acknowledge that some of these interactions that the Toronto group suggests are not easily tested for a global sample of states, and I think we have to acknowledge that we can only test so much. That's also why I think it's interesting to test subnational data on political violence against some of these theories, because you can actually test them more in more detail. For instance, we do have, for instance, rural inequality data that I'm using for my India project, and I actually don't find any relationship between indicators of scarcity and maldistribution of resources to indicate that. And that's been one of the strong arguments of this literature. I'm happy to discuss possible reiterations of that, but at least so far, and quite surprising, I must say, for my own part, we haven't been able to find very much support for the sort of inequality, rural inequality hypothesis.
There. Yes, sorry, Susan.
Thank you. I'm Susan Wright with the Office of Population Reproductive Health at USAID. I found this very interesting, and I guess this is sort of a follow-on to Anne Van Duzen's and perhaps even some of Richard's comments. The question of where do young women fit into this, not necessarily as a security issue, but as a possible mitigation factor that isn't there, I think really is worthy of some more study. It seems to me that the opportunity costs rise if you are in a relationship, if you are starting a family, if you have other aspects that make you more socially bound to the area in which you're living. So for that reason, the questions of girls' education or other ways in which young men have some potential of interacting with young women, whether it's because of cultural or lack of women, that whole question of how that becomes a stabilizing factor, I think, is kind of an interesting one. I just wanted you thinking on that. Thank you.
I just respond quickly to that. I think that's incredibly important, and definitely starting a family, getting married, having children, definitely is a factor that you should expect sort of raises opportunity costs. So that's actually one of the factors that we hope to be able to look at for this urban social disorder study that we have now. We hope to get data on marital data and other data that can inform us more of the social situation of these youth, and I think that is a very promising avenue for research. Yeah.
Can I? Is there a question? Sorry, I just didn't see.
I'm Amitai Tuval, formerly of the PSDC, Population Studies Training Center of Brown University. Currently of ITAP International. Very much enjoyed your interesting presentation. I could relate the question to anthropological demography, because anthropological demography looks at the context much more closely. As you mentioned, this dichotomy between democracy and autocracy, and there was Jennifer's comment about democratization having some risk factors, and youth bulge is also a risk factor in some ways for instability and conflict. Another way to look at it is also about nationalism and ethnic conflict, in to kind of contextualize more the different countries you see posing risk. I can think about the case study of Sri Lanka, nationalism very strong, and we had the JVP in the 80s, and the response of the government that was the situation there. In other countries, we can think about Palestine, December '87, Intifada, etc.
I think that's a very interesting suggestion. Unfortunately, data on age distribution, particularly on ethnic groups, aren't always available. But there are several interesting studies, anthropological studies as well, on this issue, including Mark Summers at Tufts University. Absolutely, that's and Sam Huntington has made some claims about the relationship between age composition between ethnic groups for Sri Lanka.
Or Lebanon.
Lebanon is over, yeah.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Hi, I'm Ella Abuzakuk. am a student at Georgetown University, as well as I'm an intern at Brookings Global Economy and Development Program, and one of their projects that they're pursuing is Middle East Youth Exclusion Project, which I would point you all to look at. It specifically researches the social and political and economic deprivations that are confronting youth in the Middle East. With that, though, one of your slides, this is a very interesting presentation, thank you so much. The slide on the clash of generations, I was a little confused because I think so often when we come to research or scrutinize the youth of the Middle East, we become so easy into falling into cultural and religious explanations that would explain their violent ambitions and aspirations, but then you go on to contextualize it. And so I was just wondering if you could clarify that slide for me a little bit more, because I know you cited Huntington and Zakaria, and just again emphasize the importance of looking into the more political, socioeconomic conditions that would explain maybe the propensities for violence.
First, let me say that I think the Brookings Institution project on youth and social exclusion in the Middle East is incredibly interesting and will hopefully give us some important knowledge about how we can actually break that or facilitate large youth groups in a positive way in development. The purpose of showing the slides with the two citations was merely to show the growing interest of the issue as such. I think it's actually quite interesting because, particularly since what I see in that citation by Huntington is that he's going from the general clash of civilizations hypothesis, claiming that civilizations are inherently conflictual, and we would expect to see everywhere where civilizations meet there would be conflict. What he actually says in that interview is that we shouldn't really focus so much on ethnic identity and civilizations. We should look at the contextual factors, particularly the age composition, and I think that's an important modification of his of his general view. And also, I think that's also what Farid Zakaria says, that we have to look into the political conditions, the economic conditions of the Middle East to understand how youth exclusion feeds into possible risks of political violence there. And I think he points to some very important contextual factors, particularly stalled democratic developments and lack of opportunities, economic, social opportunities for youth in that region.
At the risk of jeopardizing my friendship with the two of them, I'd like to put a couple people on the spot. One is Bill Wise, who is now at Johns Hopkins, but served as Vice President Gore's Deputy National Security Advisor, and also Dick Smith from State, who's spent a long time within the State Department trying to grapple often with environmental issues, but some of these issues, I'm sure, playing a part of it. To ask the two of them how they've seen these issues change in terms of how they're interpreted and focused on over time within the U.S. government, particularly from the foreign and security policy perspective, and whether you have any words of advice in terms of ways to bring these issues to bear in ways that the folks who don't have this as their primary portfolio might be more likely to take it on and integrate it into the work that they're doing. So
he departed a few minutes ago, but go ahead. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
You raise some very good questions, and it's particularly difficult to answer for someone who has been out of government for almost a decade now. And looking at these problems now from an academic perspective instead of a policy perspective, but trying to put myself back into government shoes, this problem of youth bulge in particular came to my attention through working on security issues in the Philippines. It wasn't something that arrived on my desk, so to speak, in an academic context. It arrived before my eyes in an anecdotal sense by simply being in the Philippines, in the rural parts of the Philippines, looking at what was then the New People's Army insurgency in the mid-1980s. At that time, there was no particular academic context into which I could put this, or my colleagues could put this. It was simply a intuitive sense that working in the or traveling in the rural areas and talking to persons involved on all sides of the conflict there, it became very clear that there was a large pool of under or unemployed young men who had a significant set of grievances with either the government or the local power structure. At the time, there was no way for us to, and that had implications for security in the country, but there was no way to organize that knowledge at the time that I was aware of to help frame policy. I would hope that that gulf has been bridged in succeeding years, in part as a consequence of the work that the Environmental Change and Security Project has done and the various associates you have here. But the question that you asked, how to get the academic material into the policy making, into the eyes of policy makers, probably the best route is to, I think, and you and I, Jeff, have discussed this in the past, the best route is to the intelligence community. That is the place that has been the best place to organize knowledge for policymakers. It's unfortunate that there aren't other places in the government that have been as effective, but the intelligence community probably is the best route. And the opening of the intelligence community, which has occurred since I left government, into the open source area is probably the greatest, the most important development in that respect. So the more open source data that is produced, and the more the intelligence community reaches out to the academic and quasi-academic producers of open source intelligence, probably the more policy will be informed by it. I think that the integration of policy-making interests and academic information probably is at its ascendancy, probably is as good as it has been. But it's not something that is a guarantee, and it requires people on both sides to be dedicated to that intercourse and not complacent about its natural force, because it really doesn't have a natural force.
Perfect. Thank you, Bill. If you could hand it over to
that
Jeff.
Also was about as vacuous a comment as
No, on the contrary. I mean, I think the fact that Rich Sincata is sitting right next to you as a new employee of the National Intelligence Council taking demography seriously is Exhibit A in terms of getting this research being taken seriously by someone who knows what he's talking about on the issue. So.
I certainly didn't find it vacuous. I think it was a very interesting presentation. I guess first became intensely involved in this in about the mid-'90s when I was working at the National Intelligence Council as a deputy and National Intelligence Officer for global issues, which they had at that time. They've since folded into the economic side, which is unfortunate. But in any case, I wanted to look at population. And at that time, we did focus a lot on the youth bulge, and we did get into, in a preliminary way, a lot of these. It was obvious to us that that high levels of youth and intense populations in Singapore were far different than in other places, and that this was not a simple question, and that we had to have a lot more research. And I'm very encouraged with the work that you have done and that's been represented by the presentations today. I think we are getting to a degree of subtlety now where we really can grasp policy issues in a way we couldn't before. So I was glad to be sort of in it at the beginning for the government, I think, at least in the intelligence side, and in looking at these issues and using open sources as well as well, mostly open sources for that particular national intelligence estimate. I already had my say. I think one of the key issues is how you deal with this bifurcated situation where you have, to simplify, crashing populations in developed countries and growing populations in developing countries, because one of the key ties is the capacity of governments to deal with these youth. And unfortunately, the problem is reversed. the countries most capable of dealing with large numbers of youth are the ones that have falling populations and percentage of youth, and the opposite's true in the developing country. So that there has got to be, it seems to me, fairly massive migration, and it hasn't been handled very well in the past, and we've really got to get into those questions of how that necessary shift is going to take place in a way that doesn't, bring a lot of complications of its own. But I'm very encouraged by the work that's been done and what's been said here today, and I think we're on the right track.
Okay, thank you, Dick. Well, we're about at the end. I don't know if either of you have any kind of concluding impressions or things that you meant to say that you've forgotten up to this point that you'd like to add to the discussion.
I would just like to thank you all for great comments and for showing up. I'm very encouraged to see that there is a great interest in this issue, and hopefully there is also going to be a great interest in continuing research in this area to hopefully pinpoint some of the specifics that we can't really pinpoint right now. So thank you all for showing up.
Thank you.
Yeah, go.